My friend, let me tell you something I learned when I was just 17 years old. Standing on the streets of Philadelphia with exactly $1 in my pocket and 3 puffy rolls tucked under my arms because I didn't know any better, I looked absolutely ridiculous. My clothes were dirty, my pockets were stuffed with shirts and stockings, and I was walking through town eating bread like some kind of fool, while a young woman named Deborah Reed watched me from her doorway and laughed at the sight. That woman would later become my wife, but at that moment, I was nothing, nobody. Just another runaway apprentice who'd fled his brother's print shop in Boston because I couldn't stand being beaten and belittled anymore. Now, you might wonder why I'm telling you this story, why I'm starting here in what seemed like my lowest moment. It's because that day, hungry and foolish as I was, I understood something that most people never figure out in their entire lives. I understood that I had absolutely nothing except one thing. One single thing that would determine whether I died poor and forgotten in some gutter or whether I would become someone who mattered. And that one thing, my friend, is what I want to share with you today, because if you can grasp this, if you can really take hold of what I'm about to tell you, your entire life will change. Not tomorrow, not next week, but starting right now, this very moment. See, most people think success is about talent. They think it's about being born into the right family, having money, having connections, being naturally gifted at something. And sure, those things can help. They can give you a head start. But I've known plenty of talented people who died with nothing. I've known people born into wealthy families who squandered everything. And I've known people like me, people who started with less than nothing, who built lives of meaning, prosperity, and genuine contribution to this world. What makes the difference? What separates those who rise from those who remain stuck? It's not what you think. It's not luck. It's not even intelligence, though that helps. It's something far more fundamental, something so simple that most people dismiss it entirely, and yet so powerful that once you understand it, once you truly embrace it, everything else falls into place. It's this. Wealth flows to those who understand value. Not price, not cost, but true value. And here's what they don't teach you in school. What your parents probably never learned. What keeps generation after generation trapped in the same financial patterns. Value isn't what something costs. Value is what something is worth to someone else. Let me show you what I mean, because this distinction changed everything for me. When I was a young printer in Philadelphia, barely 20 years old, I noticed something peculiar. The other printers in town, they'd price their services based on their costs. Paper costs this much, ink costs that much, labor costs something else, add it all together, tack on a small profit, and there's your price. They were thinking about themselves, about their needs, about what they needed to charge to survive. I did the opposite. I asked myself, what is this printed material worth to my customer? If I'm printing a merchant's advertisements, what value does that advertisement create for him? If it brings him 10 new customers, each spending £5, that's £50 of value. Suddenly, my fee of £2 doesn't seem expensive, it seems like the bargain of the century. This is how the wealthy think, and it's the complete inverse of how everyone else operates. The poor think about what they need to charge. The wealthy think about what they can provide. The poor think about their time. The wealthy think about impact. The poor say, I need to make at least this much per hour to pay my bills. The wealthy say, what problem can I solve that people desperately need solved? You see it everywhere once you start looking. The struggling freelancer charges by the hour because they're thinking about their time. The thriving consultant charges by the project because they're thinking about the transformation they deliver. Same work, sometimes. Vastly different compensation. Why? Because one is selling time, a commodity everyone has. The other is selling results, something rare and precious. This is the first lens through which the wealthy see the world. They see needs, problems, desires, gaps in the market. They see a world full of people who want things, need things, would pay handsomely for things if only someone would provide them. And here's the beautiful part, the part that should excite you. You don't need capital to start seeing this way. You don't need connections. You don't need a prestigious education or a family name. You just need to stop thinking about yourself for a moment and start thinking about others. What do people around you complain about? What do they wish existed but doesn't? What tasks do they hate doing? What problems keep them awake at night? These are opportunities. Every single one. In my time, I noticed people struggled to keep informed about local news and events. So I started a newspaper. I noticed Philadelphia lacked a proper library. So I organized a subscription library, the first of its kind in America. I noticed the city had no organized fire protection. So I founded a volunteer fire company. Was I uniquely brilliant? No. I was simply paying attention to what people needed. And here's what happened. By solving problems for others, by creating value for my community, wealth flowed to me as a natural consequence. Not because I was chasing money, but because I was creating value, and money is simply how society keeps score of value created. This is the paradox the wealthy understand and the poor never grasp. The fastest way to wealth is to stop chasing wealth and start creating value. Let me share with you the second foundational truth that separates the wealthy from everyone else. Wealthy people are intimate friends with discomfort, while poor people are constantly seeking comfort. You see, most people organize their entire lives around avoiding discomfort. They'll stay in jobs they hate because the discomfort of staying feels less threatening than the discomfort of leaving. They'll avoid difficult conversations for years, letting resentment build like compound interest, all because 20 minutes of awkwardness feels unbearable. They'll choose the comfortable meal, the comfortable routine, the comfortable opinion, even when that comfort is slowly suffocating their potential. I learned this truth during my first winter as a printer's apprentice. My brother James ran the shop, and he was a harsh master. I was 12 years old, working 14-hour days, my fingers raw from handling cold metal type, my back aching from the press. Every morning when that freezing workshop called to me in the darkness before dawn, every fiber of my being screamed for the comfort of my bed. And here's what I discovered. On the other side of that discomfort was capability. Every morning I chose the discomfort of rising early. I was building a version of myself who could do hard things. Every time I set type until my fingers bled, I was depositing discipline into an account that would pay dividends for the rest of my life. The poor mistake comfort for happiness. They think that if they can just arrange their lives to minimize discomfort, they'll finally be content. But comfort is quicksand. The more you seek it, the more it swallows you. You become weaker, more fragile, less capable. Your tolerance for difficulty shrinks until the smallest obstacle feels insurmountable. I watched this play out countless times in Philadelphia. Young men would come to the city with ambition burning in their hearts, but the moment they achieved a modicum of comfort, something would change. They'd stop waking early. They'd start taking longer breaks. They'd avoid the difficult projects, the challenging clients, the opportunities that required them to stretch beyond their current abilities. They were like metal left out in the rain, slowly rusting, slowly losing their edge. The wealthy understand something profound. Discomfort is not something to be avoided, it's something to be strategically embraced. Every significant expansion of your capability, every meaningful increase in your income, every breakthrough in your business requires you to become comfortable being uncomfortable. When I decided to establish my own printing shop at age 22, I had to become comfortable with the discomfort of massive debt. When I launched the Pennsylvania Gazette, I had to become comfortable with the discomfort of public criticism. When I began my electrical experiments, I had to become comfortable with the discomfort of being mocked by established scientists. Each of these discomforts was a doorway, and on the other side was a larger version of myself. Here's the pattern I observed. Poor people make decisions to minimize immediate discomfort, while wealthy people make decisions to maximize long-term capability, even when it means short-term discomfort. The poor choose the comfortable conversation. The wealthy choose the truthful one. The poor avoid difficult learning. The wealthy run toward it. The poor organize their day around comfort. The wealthy organize their day around growth. I created what I called my virtue journal, where I tracked 13 virtues I wanted to develop. Every week, I focused on one virtue with particular intensity, noting every failure in a small book I carried with me. Let me tell you, There is nothing comfortable about confronting your failures in writing every single day. Nothing comfortable about seeing your pride, your temper, your laziness documented in your own hand. But that discomfort was the forge in which character was built. I kept that book not because I enjoyed looking at my failures, but because I understood something most people never grasp. You cannot defeat an enemy you refuse to see. And your worst enemy isn't out there in the world, it's the version of yourself you could become if you stop paying attention. Every week, I would review my chart. And let me be honest with you, most weeks looked like a battlefield after a loss. Black marks everywhere. Pride wounded here. Temperance defeated there. Industry surrendered on Tuesday afternoon. But here's what happened over time. And this is the part that changed everything. The marks began to mean something different. At first, each black mark felt like a condemnation. You failed again, Franklin. You're not who you thought you were. But as weeks turned into months, those marks transformed into something else entirely. They became data, intelligence reports from the field of my own behavior. I started to notice patterns. My temperance always collapsed on Saturday evenings when I was with certain friends. My industry faltered specifically after lunch, when my body was heavy and my mind was slow. My silence failed most often when someone challenged my ideas in front of others. My pride couldn't bear to let an argument go unanswered. These weren't random failures, they were signals. And once I could see the patterns, I could interrupt them. I could avoid those friends on Saturday evenings, or at least prepare myself mentally before seeing them. I could schedule my most difficult work for the morning hours when my mind was sharp. I could literally bite my tongue, and I did when I felt that surge of defensive pride rising in my throat. The chart didn't just show me where I was failing. It showed me where I was lying to myself about who I was. You see, we all carry around these beautiful stories about ourselves. I'm a hard worker. I'm honest. I'm reasonable. I'm kind. And maybe we are those things sometimes, in certain conditions, when we're well rested and nobody's testing us. But the chart revealed the truth beneath the story. It showed me that I wasn't naturally virtuous. I was conditionally virtuous. And if I wanted to become genuinely virtuous, I needed to expand the conditions under which I could maintain my character. This is the work nobody wants to do. It's so much easier to react to life, to justify your behavior, to blame circumstances. She made me angry. He was unreasonable first. I was tired. The situation was impossible. And you know what? Sometimes those things are true, but they're also irrelevant to the project of building character. Because character isn't who you are when everything is going well. Character is who you remain when everything is falling apart. I remember one particular week, it must have been 6 or 7 months into this practice, when I looked at my chart and saw hardly any marks at all. Just a few scattered black dots across all 13 virtues. And I felt this surge of pride. Oh, the irony, this sense that I had finally achieved it. Finally become the man I'd set out to become. Then the very next week was an absolute disaster. Every virtue violated multiple times. My chart looked like someone had spilled ink across it. What happened? Had I suddenly lost all my progress? Become a different person overnight? No. What happened was that I got comfortable. I started to believe I had arrived, rather than understanding that I was simply traveling in the right direction. The moment I stopped paying attention, the moment I stopped checking my chart, stopped reviewing my behavior, old patterns rushed back in like water through a crack in a dam. That week taught me something crucial. Virtue isn't a destination you reach. It's a practice you maintain. It's not something you achieve once and then possess forever. It's something you choose, again and again, day after day, in the small moments when nobody's watching. And let me tell you, those small moments are where character truly lives. The letter you write when you're angry, but you set it aside for a day before sending. The promise you made to yourself that nobody else knows about. The way you treat the servant who can do nothing for your reputation, the clerk who will never advance your interests, the child who offers you nothing but questions and interruptions. I remember a moment from my printing days that taught me this lesson more powerfully than any philosophical treatise. A young man came to my shop, desperate for work. He had no references, no skills worth mentioning, and a manner that suggested he'd spent more time in taverns than workshops. Every practical consideration told me to send him away. But I'd been that young man once. Hungry, unproven, dismissed by those who should have helped me. So I gave him a trial not because it was wise, but because it was right. That young man became one of my most loyal workers. But here's what matters. Even if he hadn't, even if he'd stolen from me or disappeared after a week, the decision would still have been right. Because virtue isn't measured by outcomes. It's measured by choices made when you don't yet know the outcome. This is what I mean by daily practice. You don't wait for the grand gesture, the heroic moment, the chance to demonstrate your principles before an admiring crowd. You practice in the print shop, in the quiet morning, in the letter nobody else will read, in the decision that affects only the person who has no power to reward you. I kept a small notebook. You may have heard of this habit of mine. Each day, I would mark whether I had lived up to certain virtues: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, humility. 13 virtues, a week devoted to each, cycling through them 4 times a year. People often smile at this when they hear of it. It seems so mechanical, so methodical, so very. Franklin, where's the passion? Where's the spontaneity? Where's the grand romantic notion of virtue flowing naturally from a noble soul? But here's what I learned. Virtue doesn't flow naturally. Not for most of us anyway. Perhaps there are saints and sages who wake each morning bathed in moral perfection, but I was never one of them. I was a man of appetites and ambitions, capable of pettiness and pride, susceptible to all the weaknesses that flesh is heir to. The notebook wasn't about perfection. God knows I failed more often than I succeeded, particularly with that last virtue, humility, which I never quite mastered. The notebook was about attention, about making visible what would otherwise remain invisible, about refusing to let the days blur together into an unconscious stream where I drifted according to whim and convenience rather than choice and principle. When you measure something, you change your relationship to it. The simple act of asking yourself each evening, was I temperate today? Was I just? Was I sincere? That question alone transforms how you move through the world. Not because you fear the mark of failure in your notebook, but because the question awakens something in you. It calls you back to yourself. And this is crucial. The practice of virtue makes you more yourself, not less. Some people imagine that moral improvement means suppressing who you are, grinding down your individuality into some generic goodness, becoming a pale copy of every other virtuous person. Nothing could be further from the truth. Virtue doesn't erase your personality. It clarifies it. It removes the static and distortion so that your true signal can come through. The coward who becomes brave doesn't become someone else, he becomes more fully himself. The person he always sensed he could be when the fear wasn't drowning out everything else. The undisciplined person who develops self-control doesn't lose their spontaneity. They gain the freedom to be spontaneous when it matters, rather than being jerked around by every impulse like a puppet on strings. Think of it this way. A wild garden and a cultivated garden are both gardens, but only one allows each plant to reach its full potential. Without cultivation, the aggressive weeds choke out the delicate flowers, the vines strangle the fruit trees, and everything becomes a tangled mess where nothing can truly flourish. Virtue is cultivation. It's the careful work of creating conditions where your best qualities can grow strong while your worst tendencies don't run riot and destroy everything else. I've seen this in my own life dozens of times. When I stopped being so argumentative in conversation, when I gave up the need to win every debate and started genuinely listening, I didn't become less interesting. I became more interesting. People actually wanted to talk to me. They shared things they wouldn't have shared with the arrogant young printer who was so busy preparing his next clever retort that he never really heard what anyone was saying. That change, that small cultivation of humility, didn't diminish me. It opened up an entire dimension of human connection I'd been missing. Or consider frugality. One of my favorite virtues, I'll admit. When I was young and poor, I had no choice but to be frugal. But when I started earning more, I could have let that discipline go. Instead, I kept it, refined it, made it a conscious practice rather than a mere necessity. And what happened? Did I become some joyless miser counting pennies in a dark room? No, I became free. Free from the anxiety of debt. Free from the need to worry about money. free to pursue projects that interested me whether or not they paid well, free to help others without calculating the cost. Frugality didn't shrink my world, it expanded it beyond measure. Every virtue works this way. Patience doesn't make you passive. It makes you persistent, able to endure setbacks that would cause an impatient person to quit. Honesty doesn't make you naive, it makes you trustworthy. And trustworthiness opens doors that manipulation could never breach. Industry doesn't make you a drudge. It makes you capable of actually completing the ambitious projects that lazy people can only dream about. And here's something else worth noting. The practice of virtue changes how you experience time itself. When you're controlled by your worst impulses, procrastination, anger, envy, whatever time feels chaotic and slippery, days blur together. You look back on weeks and can't really say what you did with them. There's a fog over everything. But when you're practicing virtue consistently, time becomes clearer, more distinct. Each day has shape and meaning. You can look back and see what you built, what you learned, what you became. The days don't disappear into a gray haze of wasted hours and regretted impulses. They accumulate into something solid, something real. This clarity extends to how you see other people as well. When you're trapped in vice, you tend to see others through a distorted lens as competitors, threats, tools to be used, obstacles in your way. But as you develop virtue, that distortion fades. You start seeing people as they actually are, fellow human beings with their own struggles and aspirations, people from whom you can learn, people with whom you can create something meaningful. I've watched this transformation in my own life. When I was younger, consumed with proving myself, I found collaboration difficult. Every conversation felt like a negotiation where I needed to come out on top. I'd interrupt people mid-sentence, not because I was genuinely excited about the ideas forming in my head, but because I needed them to know I was intelligent. I needed to be the smartest person in the room. What a waste of energy. As I worked on my virtues, particularly on humility and sincerity, something shifted. I started actually listening to people, not listening while preparing my response, but truly listening. And you know what I discovered? People are absolutely fascinating when you give them space to be themselves. That printer I once saw as competition, he knew techniques I'd never considered. That merchant I dismissed as unsophisticated, he understood human nature in ways that would take me years to grasp. The Pennsylvania Gazette became successful not because I was the smartest person in Philadelphia, but because I learned to collaborate, to synthesize ideas, to build on what others contributed. The Junto, our mutual improvement society, worked because we checked our egos at the door. We had a rule: no direct contradiction of another member's statement. Instead, you'd say, "I imagine the matter might also be considered this way," or, in some cases, perhaps. Sounds weak, doesn't it? Like we were being overly delicate with each other's feelings? But here's what actually happened. People felt safe to share half-formed ideas, tentative suggestions, and wild speculations. And from that safe space, genuine innovation emerged. Some of our best civic improvements, the library, the fire company, the hospital, came from thoughts someone almost didn't share because they seemed too ambitious or naive. When you're virtuous, when you're genuinely humble and sincere, you create environments where other people can flourish. And here's the paradox. By making space for others to shine, you yourself become more influential, more respected, more effective than you ever would have been through force of ego alone. I'm not talking about some kind of saintly selflessness here. I'm talking about practical wisdom. The person who cultivates virtue understands that human beings are social creatures. We accomplish our greatest work together. But genuine collaboration requires trust, and trust requires virtue. You cannot build trust through clever manipulation. You cannot sustain partnerships through tactical niceness. People have an instinct for authenticity. They know, at some level, when they're being managed versus when they're being genuinely respected. This is why your list of virtues, whatever it contains, must include virtues that govern how you treat other people. For me, it was sincerity. Use no hurtful deceit. Think innocently and justly. And, if you speak, speak accordingly. It was justice. Wrong none by doing injuries, or omitting the benefits that are your duty. These weren't abstract moral principles. They were practical tools for building the kind of relationships that make meaningful work possible. And the beautiful thing? As you practice these virtues in your relationships, you get immediate feedback. Try being genuinely humble in a conversation today. Watch what happens. People relax. They open up. They share things they wouldn't normally share. The quality of the interaction transforms right before your eyes. Or, try the opposite. Be arrogant, dismissive, manipulative. Watch people's walls go up. Watch the conversation become transactional, defensive, shallow. The feedback is instant, and it's honest. Your relationships become a mirror, showing you exactly where you are in your virtue development. You think you can fake temperance on the outside? Try it. Watch yourself get irritable when the slightest inconvenience disrupts your day. Your body tells the truth, your mind tries to hide. You think you've mastered silence? Notice how quickly you interrupt, how desperately you need to fill every pause with your own voice. The virtue cards don't lie. They just reflect what's already there. I used to think I could practice these virtues privately, in some isolated laboratory of self-improvement. What nonsense! Virtue without relationship is just philosophy. It's theory. It becomes real only when tested against other human beings, with all their complications and contradictions. Here's what nobody tells you about this system. It doesn't make you perfect. It makes you aware. And awareness, my friend, is far more valuable than perfection. Because once you see the pattern, once you notice that every time you practice silence you actually interrupt less, or that your weeks focused on industry produce measurably more output, you start to trust the system. Not blindly, but empirically, through evidence you yourself have generated. The book helps you see the evidence. Every black mark is a data point. After 13 weeks, you have a complete data set about yourself. You know exactly which virtues come naturally and which require deliberate effort. You know which contexts trigger which failures. You discover patterns you never would have noticed without the documentation. For me, it was Thursday afternoons. I noticed that my marks for temperance and tranquility consistently clustered on Thursdays. Why? Eventually I realized that's when I attended a particular club meeting with several members who specialized in provocation. They would bait arguments, make inflammatory statements, and I would take the bait. Every week. Until I saw the pattern in my book. Then I could prepare. I could decide in advance. This is a silence day during the club meeting. I'm going to practice hearing without reacting. The Thursday marks decreased, not because the people changed, but because I came prepared. This is practical philosophy at its finest. You're not trying to become some abstract ideal of virtue. You're trying to navigate next Thursday afternoon. You're trying to get through tomorrow's difficult conversation. You're trying to build something worthwhile next week. The 13-week cycle gives you a laboratory, but life gives you the experiments. And here's the beautiful efficiency of it. You only focus on one virtue at a time, but they all interconnect. When you practice industry, you naturally improve your order because productive work requires structure. When you practice silence, your tranquility improves because you're not cluttering your mind and relationships with unnecessary words. The virtues form a system, not a list. Focusing on one strengthens the others. Some weeks you'll feel like a moral athlete, hitting your marks, making progress, seeing improvement. Other weeks, you'll feel like you're drowning in black marks, failing at the simplest exercises. Both are valuable. The good weeks show you what's possible. The bad weeks show you where you still have work to do. Neither is the final word, they're both just data. I kept these books for years. Sometimes I'd go back and review old cycles. I'd see how a virtue I struggled with initially became easier over time, or how a virtue I thought I'd mastered would suddenly reveal new depths of difficulty. The book became a record not just of failures but of growth, real growth, documented and undeniable. You don't have to share this book with anyone. It's not a performance for an audience, but you do have to be honest with it. If you lie in your virtue journal, you're just lying to yourself. And that's the most expensive lie you can tell. The whole system rests on your willingness to mark the truth, even when the truth is unflattering. I kept this practice going for years, Not because I achieved perfection I never did, that became obvious within the first week, but because the attempt itself was refining me. The marks in my book weren't grades on a report card. They were breadcrumbs showing me the path I'd actually walked versus the path I thought I was walking. And the gap between those two paths? That's where all the real work lives. Some weeks I'd look at my chart and see I'd made progress on temperance but slipped on industry. Other weeks, sincerity would be my downfall while order improved. It was like trying to keep multiple plates spinning at once. Focus too hard on one virtue and another would wobble. But over time, patterns emerged. I began to see which virtues were naturally strong in me and which ones required constant vigilance. Humility, as I mentioned, was my late addition, and let me be candid with you, it remained my most frequent failure. Still does, if I'm being honest. There's something about achieving a small measure of success that makes a man want to tell everyone about it, and I was no exception. I'd spend a week practicing silence, doing quite well with it, and then I'd want to announce to everyone how good I'd become at not talking. You see the problem. The very act of improving made me want to boast about the improvement, which immediately violated the virtue I was trying to cultivate. This is the paradox built into self-improvement. The better you get, the more tempted you are to take credit for it, to puff yourself up, to believe you've arrived. And the moment you believe you've arrived, you've actually departed. Humility isn't a destination. It's a practice you never complete, a discipline that resets itself every morning. But here's what the journal did for me that no amount of abstract thinking ever could. It made virtue concrete. It gave me something to aim at each day. When I woke up in the morning, I knew which virtue I was focusing on. That focus shaped my decisions. If it was order week, I'd plan my day with precision. If it was industry week, I'd push myself to tackle the tasks I'd been avoiding. The virtue became a lens through which I viewed my choices. And slowly, imperceptibly, I became a different person than the one who started. Not perfect, never perfect, but more deliberate, more intentional, less tossed around by impulse and circumstance. My temper cooled, my work ethic sharpened, my habits aligned more closely with my intentions. And people noticed. They didn't know about the little book I kept, but they saw the results of it in how I conducted myself. That's the secret of character, really. Nobody sees the private work. They only see what that work produces. You could stand in the town square and announce your intentions to be virtuous, and people would shrug and forget it by evening. But quietly transform your behavior over months and years, and people will seek you out. They'll trust you with their business, their confidences, their resources, not because you told them you were trustworthy, but because you showed them through consistent action. This journal, this simple system of marks and accountability, became one of the foundations of everything I built. My printing business thrived partly because of industry and order. My inventions came partly from industry and curiosity working together. My diplomatic work succeeded partly because I'd practiced silence and sincerity and learned when to deploy each. The friendships I cultivated lasted because I'd worked on justice and sincerity, on being a man whose word meant something. The virtues reinforced each other like the threads in a strong rope. Temperance in eating kept my mind clear for resolution in my work. Frugality gave me resources that industry multiplied. Sincerity built trust that justice maintained. None stood entirely alone, they wove together into something stronger than any single strand. I'll confess something about this system that might surprise you. I never achieved perfection, not even close. My chart remained spotted with marks throughout my life. There were weeks when I barely touched it, months when I abandoned the practice entirely. During my years in London and Paris, the little book often sat forgotten in a drawer while I attended dinners, enjoyed wine, and stayed up far too late in fascinating conversation. And yet, and this is the remarkable part, the practice had changed me anyway. The habits I'd built during my focused weeks persisted, even when I wasn't actively tracking them. The neural pathways, as we might say today, had been carved. The person I'd worked to become had become, in large measure, who I was. Think of it like learning to ride a horse. At first, you must consciously think about every movement, your posture, your grip on the reins, the pressure of your legs. It requires intense focus. But once you've truly learned, you can ride while thinking of other things. The skill has moved from conscious effort to unconscious competence. My virtue practice worked similarly. Order might never have become automatic for me. I fought that battle my whole life, but industry had. So had sincerity. I no longer had to remind myself to keep my word. Breaking it felt wrong at a visceral level. The practice had shaped my character in ways that persisted beyond the practice itself. This is what I want you to understand. The goal isn't perfection. The goal is direction. The goal is to be moving toward the person you wish to become, even if you never fully arrive. A ship that corrects its course daily, even imperfectly, will reach a far better destination than one that simply drifts. I learned, too, that returning to the practice after falling away from it was itself a virtue, perhaps a 13th one I should have named. Call it resilience, or perseverance, or simply refusing to let temporary failure become permanent defeat. Some of my most valuable weeks with the virtue chart came after months of neglecting it, when I'd notice my life drifting off course and think, time to return to my old method. There's no shame in falling. The shame, if there is any, lies in refusing to rise again. In my later years, I looked back at my younger self's ambitious plan to cycle through all 13 virtues 4 times a year, to achieve moral perfection, to become an unblemished exemplar of human excellence, and I had to smile at the audacity of it, the hubris, even. But I didn't smile with regret. That young printer who believed he could systematically perfect himself had been naive, yes, but his naivety had been productive. His impossible goal had produced possible results. His reach had exceeded his grasp, as it should, and in reaching, he'd stretched himself into a shape that served him well. Would I have worked as hard at self-improvement if my goal had been merely to become slightly better? I doubt it. The ambitious goal created ambitious effort. The gap between aspiration and achievement became not a source of shame but a space for lifelong growth. And in the end, that space is where we all live, in the gap between who we are and who we wish to become. The question isn't whether the gap exists. It always does, for anyone honest enough to acknowledge it. The question is what we do with it. Do we pretend it isn't there, insisting we're already everything we should be? Do we stare into it with despair, convinced we'll never bridge it? Or do we work at it, day by day, imperfectly but persistently, building our small bridge across? I chose the third way. And though I never crossed the gap entirely, I moved far enough along that bridge to see views I never could have imagined from where I started. Now let me speak plainly about something that troubled me then and troubles humanity still, the delusion that we can remake ourselves overnight. I see it in your time more than ever, the promise of transformation in 30 days, the course that claims to rewire your brain by next Tuesday, the guru who swears you'll unlock your true self before the weekend's out. It's nonsense. Dangerous nonsense. Not because change is impossible, I'm living proof it isn't, but because these promises corrupt the very mechanism by which real change occurs. They train you to seek magic when you should be learning carpentry. They teach you to wait for lightning when you should be gathering kindling. Here's what I learned through decades of trying and failing, and trying again. Lasting change is built on the foundation of tiny, nearly invisible decisions. Repeated so many times they become the bedrock of who you are. Let me show you what I mean with something specific from my own transformation. When I was working to control my temper, and Lord, what a temper it was, I didn't wake up one morning suddenly serene. What happened was far less dramatic and far more effective. I started with this. When I felt anger rising, I would not speak for 10 seconds. That's all. 10 seconds of silence before responding to provocation. Some days I managed it. Many days I didn't. But here's what those 10 seconds did. They created a tiny gap between stimulus and response. In that gap, something new could grow. After months of this practice, I added another layer. In those 10 seconds, I would silently restate the other person's position in my mind, trying to see it from their vantage point. This wasn't about being nice. It wasn't about suppressing my authentic feelings. It was about giving myself options where before I had only reflexes. A year into this practice, something remarkable happened. I was in a heated negotiation over a printing contract. The other party was being, in my view, deliberately obstinate and dishonest. The old me would have exploded, burned the bridge, lost the contract, and spent the next week justifying my righteous anger. Instead, I felt the familiar heat rising, and then something different happened. Not calm, exactly, but space, room to think. And in that space, I saw that what I'd interpreted as dishonesty was actually fear. This man was afraid of being cheated just as I was. I didn't become a saint in that moment, but I became someone with a choice, and I chose differently than I would have before. This is how real change happens, not in the dramatic breakthrough, but in the 10,000 tiny choices that precede it, building up like coral building a reef so slowly you can't see it happening, until one day you realize you're standing on solid ground where there used to be only water. The modern addiction to rapid transformation isn't just ineffective, it's actively harmful because it causes people to abandon the only method that actually works. When the promised 30-day metamorphosis doesn't materialize, people don't think, that method was flawed. They think, I am flawed. Change is impossible for me. And so they stop trying. Or worse, they become transformation junkies, leaping from promise to promise, mistaking the excitement of beginning for the satisfaction of building. I spent 13 weeks focused on each virtue in my system. 13 weeks for one virtue, and I cycled through all 13 virtues 4 times per year. That's 4 years before I completed the cycle just once at that depth. Did it work? Not the way I imagined. I never became perfectly temperate or orderly or frugal. But something else happened. Something better than perfection. I became someone who was consciously working on himself, who had a method, who could track progress over months and years rather than hours and days. The method itself became a virtue, the practice of paying attention, of honest self-assessment, of showing up again after failing again. I think about the young tradesmen I knew in my printing days. Men of equal talent, equal opportunity, many of superior education. Where are they now? Some drank their shops away. Others alienated every customer with their pride. Still others worked themselves into early graves, pursuing perfection in every trivial detail, unable to distinguish the essential from the ornamental. And where am I? Not perfect, not even close, but still here, still working, still improving. The method gave me something money cannot buy: the ability to learn from my own life. Each week's markings became data. Each month's review became insight. I could see patterns invisible to those who simply lived day to day, reacting, repeating, wondering why the same problems kept arising. I noticed, for instance, that my failures at temperance almost always preceded failures at industry. A heavy evening led to a sluggish morning, which led to postponed work, which led to anxiety, which led to another heavy evening. One broken link weakened the entire chain. I noticed that weeks when I succeeded at order, when I kept my papers arranged, my appointments punctual, my workspace clean, were weeks when everything else came easier. Order created mental space. Chaos consumed it. These insights didn't make me perfect, but they made me capable. They transformed self-improvement from wishful thinking into practical engineering. And here's what surprises people when I show them my book of charts. I failed far more than I succeeded. Pages upon pages of marks, some weeks so black with ink they look like mourning bands. But I kept going. The method didn't demand perfection. It demanded honesty and persistence. This is what most people miss about self-improvement. They think the goal is to become flawless, and when they inevitably fall short, they abandon the project entirely. All or nothing. Perfect or worthless. But the real goal is simply to become better than you were, not better than someone else. Not perfect, just measurably improved compared to your former self. And the miracle of this approach is that small improvements compound over time in ways that dramatic transformations never do. The man who improves himself by 1% each week, even accounting for backsliding and failure, will be unrecognizably better in a year. The man who tries to transform completely and fails will be unchanged in a decade. I am now in my 80s. I have been keeping these charts, in various forms, for over 60 years. And I can tell you with certainty, I am still not perfectly temperate, orderly, resolute, frugal, industrious, sincere, just, moderate, clean, tranquil, chaste, or humble. But I am far, far better at all of them than I was at 20. And that incremental improvement has made all the difference in my business, my relationships, my public service, my happiness, and whatever legacy I might leave behind. The charts themselves matter less than the consciousness they cultivate. After years of tracking, you internalize the practice. You develop an inner observer who watches your choices with neither harsh judgment nor easy excuse, but with honest assessment and gentle correction. This observer becomes your truest friend, the one who sees your faults clearly, but loves you anyway, who expects your best but forgives your worst, who celebrates your small victories. Because small victories are all any of us ever really achieve. This internal friendship changes everything. You stop performing goodness for others and start practicing it for yourself. The ledger becomes less about proving your worth and more about discovering who you truly are beneath all the roles you play. The worker, the parent, the friend, the citizen. It reveals the person you are when no one is watching, which is, of course, the only person you truly are. I'll confess something else. The longer I kept my books, the more I realized that my 13 virtues, carefully chosen though they were, missed something essential. I had virtues of conduct, temperance, silence, order, resolution. I had virtues of character, justice, moderation, sincerity. But nowhere in my list did I include one virtue that might encompass all the others: compassion. Not the easy compassion we feel toward those who suffer obviously and innocently, but the harder compassion we must extend toward those who fail, especially when that person is ourselves. The ledger practice, if done without compassion, becomes merely a different kind of tyranny, a self-imposed judgment day that arrives every evening, leaving you diminished rather than strengthened. True self-improvement requires that you look at your failures with the same generosity you'd show to a dear friend who stumbled. You wouldn't abandon a friend for being imperfect. You wouldn't declare them hopeless after a week of mistakes. Yet we do this to ourselves constantly, then wonder why self-improvement feels like self-punishment. The accounting must be done with love, not indulgent love that excuses everything, but honest love that sees clearly and still chooses kindness. When you note that you lost your temper, let there be sadness but not contempt. When you mark that you wasted an afternoon, let there be resolution but not rage. The goal isn't to berate yourself into excellence, but to guide yourself toward it, step by patient step. As the years pass and the ledgers accumulate, something else emerges, a long view that daily observation alone cannot provide. You begin to see not just the failure of Tuesday or the success of Friday, but the larger patterns of your life. You see how stress makes you sharp-tongued, how hunger makes you hasty, how fatigue makes you pessimistic. You learn your own internal weather, the conditions under which you flourish, and those under which you founder. This knowledge becomes practical wisdom. You can't always control circumstances, but you can recognize them and adjust accordingly. On the difficult days, you lower your expectations and forgive more freely. On the good days, you press forward, knowing such days are gifts not to be squandered. You stop expecting yourself to be a hero every moment and accept that life is long, progress is gradual, and consistency matters more than intensity. The accounting also teaches you about seasons. Some months, you make tremendous progress. You keep every resolution, maintain every habit, feel yourself transforming. Then something shifts: an illness, a crisis, a simple exhaustion of will, and you slide backward. The old version of you might have seen this as total failure and abandoned the project entirely. But the ledger shows you that such seasons have come before and passed before. Regression isn't permanent. It's part of the rhythm. You learn to be patient with yourself through winters of the soul, trusting that spring eventually returns. You learn that self-improvement isn't a straight line upward but a spiral. Sometimes you revisit old problems, but you meet them at a higher level, with more wisdom, more compassion, more strength than before. In my later years, I kept the books less rigidly, but the habit of self-examination never left me. It had become part of my character, as natural as breathing. I didn't need the formal structure anymore because I carried the observer within me always.